There is a question almost nobody asks, and it is the most important question you will hear all day. What if the person who upsets you the most has absolutely no power of their own, and every bit of power they seem to hold over you is power you have been handing them, piece by piece, reaction by reaction, without ever realizing you were the one holding the keys the entire time? Sit with that for a second. Because it changes everything. We tend to think of toxic people as powerful. We describe them that way without even noticing the language we're using. She has such a hold on me. He knows exactly how to get under my skin. I can't help it, she just pushes my buttons. Notice the structure of those sentences. In every single one, the toxic person is the subject, the one doing the action, and we are the object, the one things are being done to. But that structure is a lie. A convincing one. A lie so old and so deeply embedded in how we talk about conflict that most people never even think to question it. Here is the truth this script is going to walk you through, slowly and completely, until it becomes something you don't just understand intellectually but actually feel in your body. Toxic people do not have power. They have a strategy. And that strategy depends entirely on one single ingredient that only you can provide. Your reaction. Remove the reaction, and you don't just weaken the strategy. You dismantle it completely. You take a person who has spent years, sometimes decades, perfecting the art of provoking you, and you turn them into someone standing in an empty room, throwing punches at air. This is what we are building today. Let's begin. The machine behind the provocation. I want you to picture something with me. Imagine a vending machine. You put in a coin, and it gives you exactly what the mechanism is designed to give you. Every single time. The machine doesn't think about it. It doesn't deliberate. It doesn't have a moral position on whether you deserve the snack. The coin goes in, the mechanism activates, the product comes out. That's the entire transaction. For years, this is what many of us have been to the toxic people in our lives. A vending machine. They learned, often through nothing more sophisticated than trial and error, exactly which coin produces exactly which reaction. The comment about your weight produces defensiveness. The comparison to your sibling produces shame. The accusation that you're too sensitive produces a flood of over-explanation as you try, desperately, to prove that you're not. The silent treatment produces anxious pursuit. The sudden warmth after weeks of coldness produces relief so intense you forget to ask why the coldness happened in the first place. Coin in, product out. Every time. Predictable as gravity. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. They didn't need to be intelligent to discover this. They didn't need a degree in psychology or some sinister master plan drawn up in advance. All they needed was repetition and your consistency. You reacted the same way enough times that the pattern became obvious, even to someone operating on pure instinct rather than conscious strategy. The machine taught the person how to use it. That is how this works in the overwhelming majority of cases. It is not that toxic people are masterminds. It is that we are remarkably, almost mechanically, consistent in how we respond to certain stimuli, and consistency is the only raw material manipulation requires. This is actually good news, even though it might not feel like it yet. Because a vending machine that learns it can stop being a vending machine. A pattern that was taught can be untaught. And the moment you stop producing the predictable output, the entire mechanism that took years to build collapses in a single afternoon, because it was never actually about them being powerful. It was about a transaction you can simply stop participating in. Why your reaction is the entire point. Let's go deeper into why the reaction matters so much, because understanding this on a mechanical level is what makes the discipline of not reacting actually sustainable, rather than something you white-knuckle through for a week before falling back into old patterns. A toxic interaction has a goal, even when the person enacting it couldn't articulate that goal if you ask them directly. The goal is almost never actually about the content of what's being said. The argument about whether you left the dishes in the sink, the criticism about how you're raising your children, the accusation that you've changed and aren't who you used to be, none of that is really the point. Those are vehicles. What the toxic dynamic is actually hunting for is evidence that they still have access to you. That they can still produce an effect. That you are still, in some fundamental way, reachable. Think about what a reaction actually communicates, stripped of all the surface content. When you get defensive, you are communicating, that landed, and it hurt enough that I need to protect myself. When you explain yourself at length, you are communicating, your opinion of me matters so much that I cannot tolerate you thinking something untrue. When you raise your voice, you are communicating, you have access to my emotional thermostat, and you just turned it up. When you go silent and withdrawn, you are communicating, you have the power to make me retreat. Every reaction, regardless of its specific form, sends the same underlying message, you still have a way in. And for a toxic dynamic, that message is the entire prize. Not the argument. Not even, in most cases, actually winning the disagreement. The prize is the confirmation that the door is still unlocked. There's a story I think about often, about a man named Patrick who worked for nearly a decade under a manager who specialized in what people in psychology circles sometimes call intermittent reinforcement, unpredictable cycles of harshness followed by unexpected warmth, criticism followed by sudden, disarming praise. Patrick spent years trying to crack the code, convinced that if he just worked hard enough, communicated clearly enough, anticipated the moods accurately enough, he could finally stabilize the relationship and make the warmth consistent. It never worked. It was never going to work, because the inconsistency wasn't a problem Patrick could solve through better performance. The inconsistency was the entire mechanism. It kept Patrick reaching, reacting, recalibrating, trying, which is to say, it kept Patrick exactly where the dynamic needed him to be. What finally changed things wasn't a confrontation. Patrick never delivered some triumphant speech that put his manager in their place. What changed things was quieter and, honestly, much less satisfying to imagine in advance. Patrick simply stopped reacting. Not coldly, not as a power move, but because he had finally, fully metabolized the truth that his manager's moods were not information about Patrick's worth, and therefore did not require an emotional response calibrated to their intensity. The harsh comments came. Patrick acknowledged them factually, without the old flood of anxious explanation. The sudden warmth came. Patrick appreciated it mildly, without the old flood of relief and renewed hope. Over time, and this is the part that surprised Patrick more than anything, his manager's behavior actually became less extreme. Not because the manager had changed in some deep psychological sense, but because the behavior had stopped producing its intended effect, and behavior that stops working tends, eventually, to fade. This is the mechanism you are learning to interrupt. Not through force. Through withdrawal of the one resource the entire system was built to harvest. The difference between suppressing and not reacting. I need to pause here and address something important, because if I don't, this entire teaching risks being misunderstood in a way that could actually hurt you. Not reacting does not mean suppressing. Suppression is what happens when you feel the full force of hurt, anger, or fear, and you shove it down, lock it in a room in the basement of yourself, and pretend on the surface that nothing happened. Suppression looks like composure from the outside. But internally, it is corrosive. The emotion doesn't disappear just because you didn't display it. It goes somewhere. It accumulates. It shows up later as anxiety you can't quite locate the source of, as a short fuse with people who had nothing to do with the original provocation, as a body that holds tension in the jaw and the shoulders and the gut because the nervous system never got to complete what it started. This is not what we are building. What we are building is something the Stoics understood with extraordinary precision 2,000 years before modern psychology had the language for it. Epictetus made a distinction that I want you to hold on to for the rest of this conversation, the difference between the initial impression and the judgment we layer on top of it. When something happens to you, a cutting remark, an act of betrayal, a provocation designed to wound, there is an initial, involuntary jolt. This is human. This is not something you can or should try to eliminate. The Stoics called these first movements, and they considered them entirely outside our control, no different from flinching at a loud noise or feeling your stomach drop when a car in front of you brakes suddenly. What is within your control, and this is the entire discipline we are practicing, is what happens in the half-second after that jolt. The judgment. The story you immediately begin constructing about what it means, what it requires of you, what response it demands. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this constantly, reminding himself again and again that it was never the event itself that disturbed a person, but the opinion they formed about the event. Not reacting, properly understood, is not about pretending the jolt didn't happen. It is about feeling the jolt fully and honestly, and then declining to immediately hand that jolt the steering wheel of your next 10 minutes, your next conversation, your next decision. This is an entirely different practice from suppression, and the difference matters enormously for your long-term well-being. Suppression says, I will not feel this. Stoic non-reactivity says, I will feel this completely, and I will still choose my response rather than letting the feeling choose it for me. One of these practices builds inner strength over time. The other quietly poisons you while looking, from the outside, almost identical. The two brothers and the insult. There is an old story, retold in many forms across many traditions, about two brothers who received the exact same insult from the exact same man on the exact same day. The man was cruel and calculated. He found the first brother in the marketplace and said something designed precisely to humiliate him in front of a crowd, a remark about his failures, delivered with theatrical contempt, intended to draw blood in public. The first brother's face went red. He shouted back. The crowd gathered to watch the spectacle. Words escalated into something close to violence before others pulled the two men apart. For the rest of the day, the first brother could think of nothing else. He replayed the exchange obsessively, rehearsing better comebacks he wished he'd thought of in the moment, his stomach in knots, his work abandoned, his evening ruined. Later that same day, the cruel man found the second brother and delivered an almost identical insult, equally public, equally designed to wound. The second brother looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, simply, that may be true. I'll have to think about it, and continued on with his errand. The crowd, expecting a second spectacle, dispersed disappointed. There was nothing to watch. The cruel man, deprived of the reaction his insult was engineered to produce, found himself oddly diminished by the encounter rather than triumphant. He had spent his best material and received, in return, almost nothing. The second brother went home that evening and slept soundly. The insult had touched him, he was human, not stone, but it had not moved in and taken up residence. He had let the words exist without granting them the authority to determine his state of mind. Here is the detail in this story that people often miss: the cruel man never targeted the second brother again. Not because the second brother won some kind of argument. He didn't even attempt one. But because there was nothing in that interaction worth repeating. The coin went into the machine, and nothing came out. Eventually, even the most persistent provocateur stops feeding a machine that no longer dispenses anything. This is what awaits you on the other side of this discipline. Not a single dramatic victory, but something quieter and more permanent, becoming a person that provocation simply stops working on, until the people who once specialized in provoking you find somewhere else to spend their energy, because yours has stopped paying out. The physiology of reaction, why this feels so hard. I want to take a moment to honor something that is rarely acknowledged in conversations like this one. Not reacting is genuinely, biologically difficult, and if you have struggled with it in the past, that struggle was never a character flaw. It was your nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems are built to do. When you perceive a threat, and a cutting remark from someone who knows exactly where your wounds are absolutely registers as a threat to the oldest, most primitive parts of your brain, your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline within a fraction of a second. Your heart rate increases. Your breathing shortens. Blood moves away from your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for reasoned, deliberate thought, and toward the muscles, preparing you to fight or flee a predator that, in the modern context, is usually just a person with a cruel comment and an agenda. This means that in the immediate aftermath of a provocation, you are, quite literally, operating with reduced access to your most rational thinking. This is not an excuse to abandon the discipline. It is context for why the discipline requires practice rather than willpower alone. You cannot simply decide, in the heat of the moment, to think clearly, any more than you can simply decide to slow your heart rate through sheer force of intention. What you can do, and this is the actual mechanism behind everything we have discussed so far, is build the pause as a trained, almost automatic response that happens before the old reactive pattern has time to fully execute. This is why the Stoics emphasize daily practice rather than occasional insight. Wisdom you only access in calm moments is not wisdom you can rely on in a crisis. Wisdom that has been rehearsed, even in small low-stakes moments, becomes available precisely when you need it most. We left off at the edge of something important. Understanding why not reacting feels so difficult is not enough on its own. Understanding is the beginning of change, never the whole of it. What separates the people who actually transform this pattern from the people who simply nod along with a video like this one and then walk straight back into the same old responses tomorrow is practice. Specific, repeatable, almost boringly consistent practice. So let's build it together, piece by piece, until you have something you can actually use the next time someone hands you that familiar coin and waits for the machine to do what it always does. The first practice, name it before it names you. The instant and NBSP, provocation lands, something remarkable becomes available to you if you know to reach for it, the simple act of naming what is happening, internally, before you do anything else. This sounds almost too small to matter. It is not. There is research spanning decades in effective neuroscience showing that the act of putting language to an emotional state, what researchers sometimes call affect labeling, actually reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, and increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason thought. In plain language, simply naming what you feel, silently, to yourself, begins shifting blood flow and brain activity away from the reactive parts of your brain and toward the deliberate ones. So when the comment lands, the cutting remark, the manipulation, the guilt trip, before you open your mouth, before your hands move, before your face arranges itself into the expression the old pattern usually produces, you say to yourself, silently, this is anger. This is the old wound. This is the hook I usually take. Notice what this small act accomplishes. It creates separation. The emotion is no longer the entire ocean you are drowning in. It becomes an object you are observing, a weather pattern moving across a sky that is not, itself, the storm. This is precisely the distinction the Stoics drew between the impression and the assent we give it. Naming the impression is the first act of refusing automatic assent. A woman named Beatrice, who spent years in a friendship marked by constant, subtle comparison and competition, described the moment this practice changed things for her. Her friend made an offhand comment at a dinner party, the kind designed to look like nothing while landing exactly where it was meant to land. In the past, Beatrice would have felt the old flush of inadequacy rise immediately, would have either gone quiet and withdrawn for the rest of the evening or overcompensated with forced cheerfulness that fooled no one, least of all herself. This time, she silently named it. This is the comparison wound. This is old. This is not actually about tonight. That naming bought her perhaps 3 seconds. 3 seconds doesn't sound like much. But in those 3 seconds, Beatrice did something she had never managed to do in that friendship before. She chose her next move instead of being thrown into it. She smiled, said something neutral, and continued her evening largely undisturbed. The comment, robbed of the reaction it was fishing for, simply dissolved into the noise of the party. Naming is not a magic trick that makes feeling disappear. It is a doorway between feeling and choosing. Walk through it every time. The second practice, the physical reset. Because reaction lives in the body before it ever reaches the mind, the second practice works directly with the body rather than waiting for thought to catch up. When you feel the old activation rising, the heat in the chest, the tightening in the jaw, the urge to defend or explain or strike back, the single most effective intervention available to you in that moment is breath. Specifically, a longer exhale than inhale. Inhale for a count of 4. Exhale for a count of 6 or 8. This activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's built-in mechanism for signaling safety, and begins physically reversing the fight-or-flight cascade that the provocation triggered. This is not a metaphor or a wellness platitude. It is mechanical. Your vagus nerve, running from your brainstem through your chest and abdomen, responds directly to the length and pattern of your breath. A long, slow exhale tells your nervous system, in a language older than conscious thought, that the danger has passed and the body can stand down. A man named Alumide, who worked in a high-conflict family business alongside a brother whose comments had wounded him for over a decade, began practicing this in the literal middle of conversations. The moment his brother's voice took on the familiar edge, Alumide would take one slow breath, invisible to anyone watching, nothing dramatic, just a slightly longer exhale than usual, before responding to anything. He told me later that this single habit did more to change the dynamic between them than years of trying to explain his feelings ever had. Not because his brother changed his behavior immediately, but because Alumide stopped supplying the escalation that had always followed his brother's provocations, and a fight requires two people feeding it to keep burning. One person, breathing instead of escalating, starves the fire of its second source of fuel. Train this when the stakes are low. Practice the long exhale in traffic, in minor irritations, in the small daily frictions of life that don't actually matter much. Build the muscle there, so it's already strong by the time you need it in a conversation that does matter. The third practice, the delay is not avoidance. There is a phrase worth memorizing and returning to whenever you feel pressure to respond immediately: you do not owe anyone an instant reaction. This runs counter to almost everything our culture teaches about conflict and communication. We have absorbed, often without examining it, the idea that a delayed response is somehow dishonest or cowardly, that the truly confident person responds immediately and decisively. This is precisely backwards. The person who requires an instant response from you is, more often than not, the person most invested in catching you before your reasoning catches up with your emotion. You are allowed to say, "I need to think about that," and then actually walk away and think about it. You are allowed to say, "Let's talk about this later," and mean it, returning to the conversation only once you've had time to locate your own clarity rather than reacting from whatever emotional state the provocation produced. You are allowed to simply not respond to a message for an hour, for a day, for as long as you need, even when every part of the old pattern is screaming that silence is dangerous, that you need to clear your name immediately, that any delay will be misinterpreted and used against you. Sometimes it will be misinterpreted. That is a cost, and it is worth paying. Because the alternative, responding immediately, from inside the activation, before you've had time to separate the impression from the judgment, almost always produces a worse outcome than a delayed, considered response ever could. There was a woman named Ingrid whose mother had a particular talent for delivering devastating remarks during phone calls and then immediately demanding Ingrid respond, often adding, "Well, aren't you going to say anything?" the moment a pause opened up, weaponizing even silence as evidence of guilt or instability. Ingrid's breakthrough came the day she finally said, calmly, "I hear you. I need some time before I respond to that," and then actually hung up the phone and gave herself that time, despite the voicemails that followed, despite the accusation that she was being dramatic by needing space. What Ingrid discovered, over months of practicing this, was that the quality of her responses improved enormously once she stopped producing them under duress. And something else happened too, something she hadn't anticipated. Her mother's comments became less frequent and less extreme over time, because the immediate, satisfying reaction they used to produce was no longer reliably available. The delay didn't just protect Ingrid. It changed the entire economics of the relationship. The fourth practice, respond to the pattern, not the performance. One of the most disorienting features of toxic interactions is how convincingly each individual incident can be made to look isolated, reasonable, even your fault, when examined alone and out of context. This is precisely why the fourth practice matters so much, training yourself to respond to the pattern across time rather than getting pulled into litigating each individual incident as though it exists in a vacuum. A single comment can almost always be explained away. "I was just having a bad day. You're reading into it. That's not what I meant." But a comment that is the 17th instance of an identical comment, stretching back years, cannot be explained away nearly so easily once you allow yourself to see it as part of a pattern rather than a standalone event. This practice asks you to keep a kind of internal ledger, not an obsessive, score-keeping resentment, but an honest, clear-eyed memory of the actual pattern across time. When the provocation lands, instead of asking only, "Is this fair?" in isolation, today, ask also, "Is this consistent with what has happened repeatedly, over months or years?" The pattern, viewed honestly, removes the persuasive power of any single incident's plausible deniability. A man named Frederick spent years doubting his own perception every time a particular colleague undermined him in meetings, because each individual instance could be reframed, in the moment, as a misunderstanding, a joke that landed wrong, an accident of timing. It was only when Frederick began mentally cataloging the pattern, not obsessively, just honestly, that he stopped being persuaded, in the moment, by each fresh round of plausible deniability. He started responding not to the performance of any single incident but to the well-documented pattern underneath it, and that shift in perspective alone drained most of his colleagues' power to destabilize him. You are not being unfair by remembering the pattern. You are finally seeing clearly what isolated incidents are specifically designed to obscure. Short story, The Garden Behind the Wall. There is an image I want to leave you with, because I think it captures something the previous stories couldn't quite reach on their own. Imagine a garden, carefully tended, full of things that took years to grow: patience, self-trust, a sense of your own worth that doesn't fluctuate with someone else's mood. Now imagine that for years, this garden had no wall. Anyone could walk through, trample what they pleased, take cuttings without asking, leave the gate open so that wind and weather could get in and damage things indiscriminately. Not reacting, properly understood, is the act of finally building the wall. This is not the same as abandoning the garden. It is not the same as refusing to ever let anyone in. A wall with a gate is still a wall worth having. You simply decide, deliberately and with clear eyes, who gets a key and who does not. The people who have shown you, again and again, that they cannot be trusted near what you've grown do not get a key. That is not cruelty. That is stewardship. A woman named Adiz spent a year building this wall, brick by brick, practice by practice, around a garden that had been trampled for most of her adult life by a string of people who mistook her openness for an open invitation. It was slow work. There were days she let someone back in out of guilt or habit, watched them trample something again, and had to rebuild that section of the wall a second time, more carefully than before. But walls built with patience hold. A year in, Adiz noticed something she hadn't expected: the people who used to provoke her most easily had largely stopped trying. Not because they had changed, but because the garden they used to access so easily had become, simply, inaccessible to them. There was nothing left for them to trample. And a person who finds a locked gate, after enough attempts, eventually stops returning to that particular wall. This is what waits for you on the other side of this practice. Not a single dramatic transformation, but a wall, built slowly, that holds. What this discipline actually gives you. I want to be honest with you about something before we close, because I think it matters more than any single technique we've discussed. This practice will not make toxic people disappear from your life immediately. It will not transform difficult relationships into easy ones overnight. Some people, faced with your new non-reactivity, will escalate before they relent, testing whether the old machine still works underneath this new exterior. This is normal. This is, in fact, evidence that the practice is working, because escalation is what happens when a strategy that used to succeed suddenly stops producing results. What this discipline gives you, steadily and reliably, is something far more valuable than the disappearance of difficult people. It gives you back the part of yourself that used to live entirely at the mercy of whoever was loudest, cruelest, or most skilled at finding your wounds. It gives you a self that exists independently of whether today is a good day or a bad day in someone else's emotional weather. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the best revenge is not to be like the one who did the injury. I have always found something quietly radical in that statement, because it relocates the entire battlefield. It says the victory was never going to be found in defeating them. The victory is in becoming someone their tactics no longer work on. That is what you are building, one paused breath, one named emotion, one delayed response, one honestly remembered pattern at a time. Not a harder shell. A steadier center. If something in this conversation found its way past your defenses and landed somewhere true, if you recognized yourself in Patrick, in Beatrice, in Alyamide, in Ingrid, in Frederick, in Adiz, then I want you to know that this is exactly the kind of work we do here, week after week, on the Stoic path. We do not offer easy comfort here. We offer the harder, more durable thing, real philosophy, real practice, real tools for becoming the kind of person that difficulty no longer gets to define. If that is what you came here looking for, subscribe to the Stoic Path right now, turn on your notifications, and stay with us, because this conversation is only one piece of a much larger journey toward the kind of inner steadiness most people spend their entire lives searching for without ever finding. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who is still reacting to a coin someone else keeps inserting. Someone who is ready, even if they don't fully believe it yet, to stop being the machine and start being the wall. Send it to them. This is the Stoic path. And the version of you that no longer reacts, steady, clear, finally your own, is closer than you think.